Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 115 critical thinking material. This is chapter 9 on causal arguments. This is a very important chapter, like the rest, but for obvious reasons. We use causal reasoning all the time in medicine, science, criminal justice settings. For those of you going into that field, we talk about cause and effect all the time in basic critical thinking and reasoning. And philosophers have had a lot to say about how to make sense of causal reasoning as well as how to evaluate it. So in this chapter, we'll look at some of the major ways causal reasoning has been connected to inductive reasoning more specifically, and we'll look at a famous method of identifying causes that has been handed down to us from the great philosopher John Stuart Mill, which we still use even to this day. So little shout out to John Stuart Mill and his influence in medical science. So let's say a little bit of background about causal reasoning. As I said, we use a lot of causal claims every day, and we use them in simple contexts as well as more complex ones. So a causal claim, we already know what a claim is. A causal claim is just a statement about the causes of things. So a simple example would be smoking causes lung cancer. Now, of course, with this example, we should be careful. I mean, it's not the case that everybody who smokes develops cancer, right? However, we think it's nonetheless safe to say or infer or reason that there is a strong correlation between smoking cigarettes and developing adverse health effects, right? Whether it's lung cancer or many other things. But notice that it's a causal claim because we're attributing lung cancer to smoking, right, as an effect. And we use causal claims within causal arguments. So as I mentioned, causal arguments are best understood as being inductive. And so a causal argument is an inductive argument whose conclusion contains a causal claim. So if I wanted to take this statement or this claim and turn it into an argument, because by itself it's just a claim, I would make something like this. Cigarettes contain large amounts of known unhealthy carcinogens. Over time, such carcinogens adversely change the cilia structure in human lungs. Therefore, smoking causes lung cancer. So notice that I've added a couple premises that lead to the establishment of the conclusion. And we think that's a strong argument. We have not just that, it's a cogent argument because the premises are true and it's strong. A big part of figuring out causal arguments is by talking about conditions, right? What are the kinds of conditions that need to be present to make the right inference or make an argument strong? Well, we want to remind ourselves of something that has been touched upon in a couple of different chapters, but really comes to a head in chapter 9, because necessary and sufficient conditions are very critical to understanding causal reasoning. So we talked about this in, as I said, a few previous chapters. I'm trying to remember. I think it was in maybe 1 or 3, somewhere in there. But we want to remind ourselves of what necessary and sufficient conditions are. So a necessary condition, again, is the condition or features that a thing must have in order to be that thing. So, for example, being 35 or older is a necessary condition for being US president, because you cannot be US president, at least now, I mean, this could change, without being 35 or older, right? That's a necessary condition. A sufficient condition, by contrast, is a condition that guarantees that something exists or is a certain kind of thing. So stepping on Sophie's tail, my cat, is a sufficient condition for making her meow, because there's lots of other things that will get Sophie to meow, but certainly stepping on her tail is one thing that would guarantee that she would meow. So there are lots of other examples that hopefully flesh this concept out. And again, we want to stress that necessary and sufficient conditions are very useful in talking about causal reasoning. So some more examples. Being a tiger is a sufficient condition for being an animal, because certainly if you're a tiger, you're an animal, but there are lots of animals that aren't tigers. But being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger, right? Because you can't be a non-animal tiger. Drinking water is a sufficient condition for quenching thirst, because we could drink a Gatorade or sparkling water or, right, something else. Having a racket is a necessary condition for playing tennis, because you can't play tennis without a racket. Burning leaves is a sufficient condition for producing smoke. Breathing oxygen is a necessary condition for living. Having the flu is a sufficient condition for feeling miserable, because lots of things can make us feel miserable, but having the flu certainly can. And then some statements can be both necessary and sufficient. So my favorite example for this, might have used this already somewhere else, but I think it works well. Being enrolled in this course is a necessary and sufficient condition for receiving a grade. Why would we say that? Well, because if you're enrolled in this course, then you will receive a grade, right, by the end of the quarter, if you're still enrolled. May not be a good grade, hopefully it is, but if you're enrolled, then you will receive a grade. And if you want a grade in this course, then you had better be enrolled. So in that sense, being enrolled is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for receiving a grade in Phil 115 critical thinking. We often frame this when we use if and only if. So if you hear statements like that, they're best thought of as expressing necessary and sufficient conditions. So if we said something like, South Seattle College will raise tuition if and only if Green River College does, what does that mean? Well, it means if South Seattle College raises tuition, then so will Green River. And if Green River raises tuition, then so will South Seattle College. So that's expressing, again, both a necessary and a sufficient condition. All right, so this is John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned at the beginning, and he's a famous 19th century British philosopher. And he wanted to talk about the logic of causation. And certainly other people had spoken about it. It's not like he invented causation, but trying to figure out the logic of causal reasoning was a big project of his. And specifically, the kind of inductive reasoning that we use today quite frequently in medical labs, in scientific research, in criminal justice settings, right? Criminology. And Mill wanted to say and discover some things about causal reasoning. What's the kind of logic that we should use for causal argumentation? And so he wrote this book, A System of Logic, in 1843, so quite a few years ago now. But it was really one of the first major works by a philosopher who wanted to, talk about the way we should think of inductive reasoning. So this book has been very influential, and a lot of the methods that we're about to talk about are very central to things that we're doing right now, like coming up with vaccines for diseases like COVID-19, how we use clinical trials when we want to test a product, or even when we want to find out what gave us food poisoning if a family goes out to dinner. So knowing a little bit about these famous methods, I think, can be extremely useful, and they're very widespread and commonplace in certain contexts. So we'll talk about 4 of Mill's famous methods. And as I said, I really want to emphasize that how influential Mill's thinking has been, not just in this area, but in other areas as well. So it's nice to give some shout outs to some well-known philosophers when they contribute something as important as this. Okay, so one of Mill's methods is called the method of agreement, and we use this, I think, quite often. The method of agreement is best thought of as identifying a necessary condition, which we just talked about, right? And it's used quite commonly in public health issues, scientific research, and other contexts. So the way of thinking about the method of agreement is, if we're looking at or trying to figure out the causes of something, if 2 or more occurrences of a phenomenon have only one relevant factor in common, that factor is probably the cause. So let's use this in an actual example. So I know post-COVID, we probably can't remember what it's like to go to restaurants or bars, but we'll just use a simple example. And I'm sure if you've had food poisoning, which I have, it's not very pleasant, right? But you always want to try to figure out, what was it that gave me the food poisoning? So that type of example works very well here. So imagine dozens of people stop in at a bar called Elmo's Bar after work, and that 5 people become ill within 1 hour after leaving the premises. We would understandably ask what caused them to become ill. Well, there are lots of possibilities, but we later find out that they all had one relevant factor in common. They all drank from the same bottle of wine. So Mill tells us we could then plausibly conclude that it was the wine. They have that in common. So if we were to make kind of like a graph or a chart, assuming this is Anthony's family, what's the one thing that we all have in common, in agreement? Well, we all had the wine, right? We didn't all have the bread, we didn't all have the pasta, and we didn't all have the pie, but we all had the wine in common. And all five of us are sick, and all 5 of us had the wine. Mill calls this the method of agreement. So obviously this kind of reasoning is quite common. Okay, the method of difference is best thought of as identifying a sufficient cause. We often frame this as what's different, or what's the difference maker in something being the cause or not the cause. So this is the relevant factor present when a phenomenon occurs, and absent when the phenomenon does not occur is likely the cause. So let's think of an example here. If you are a sports fan, I think a simple example or reference to steroids, the steroid scandal in baseball from quite a few years ago would be a good example, or the doping scandal from the Olympics. I think it was the Russian team that got disqualified. Those would be really good examples here for the method of difference. So here's the example. Suppose that the performance of a football team has been generally excellent all season, except for 6 players who have been playing some of the worst games of their careers. The only relevant difference between the high-performing and low-performing players is that the latter players have been taking some supplement. If the supplement is the only relevant difference, we could plausibly conclude that it is the cause. So maybe the difference between the high-performing players and the lower-performing players is that the lower-performing players are taking the wrong kind of drug, or maybe they're, taking something else that is causing their performance to go down, right? That's the difference between the high performing players and the lower performing players. So this is what we would call the method of difference. So to frame it another way, right, we could point to, for example, food poisoning again, right? So if my family goes out to dinner and I don't have the food poisoning, we're not going to ask what we all have in common, because let's say we all had the wine and I don't get sick. We all had the bread and I don't get sick. Pasta, we all have that and I don't get sick. But the difference is I didn't have pie. Okay, so the method of difference would tell me, right, what's the one thing that's different from me, who's not getting sick, and the other people who did get sick. We would plausibly conclude that it's the pie, right? So we don't ask what we have in common, but what's different, such that I don't have food poisoning, but the rest of my family does. Okay, and then this method is very relevant to vaccine trials and clinical trials in general. So very relevant to the amazing speed that the COVID-19 vaccine was developed. We use the joint method of agreement and difference in clinical trials every day in clinics across the world, in pharmaceutical settings, medical settings. So this is really, really crucial. This is where we combine both the method of agreement and difference, and it expresses both a necessary and a sufficient condition. So in such cases, the likely cause is the one isolated when we identify the relevant factors common to occurrences of the phenomenon and discard any of these that are present even when there are no occurrences. So to frame this another way, this is why we use control groups and experimental groups in clinical trials to do just this, the joint method of agreement and difference. So let's go back to another example, back to Elmo's bar. Say that among the 10 patrons who became ill, the common factors are that they all drank from the same bottle of wine and they all had free tacos. So we then reason that the wine or the tacos are the culprit, since we have that in common. But after further investigation, we discovered that other patrons who ate the tacos didn't become ill. So we separate that. So we can plausibly conclude that the wine is the culprit. So we identify what we have in common and then factor out the difference, and then we're left with the cause. And perhaps the best known of Mill's methods is the method of what he called the method of concomitant variation, which is just correlation. So correlations, as I'm sure you might know, play a large role in causal reasoning. When two events are correlated, when one varies in close connection with the other, they are probably causally related. So where do we use this? I mean, exercise is good, right? A good example. If you observe that the more you exercise, the more energy you have, then it seems safe to conclude that there's a causal connection between exercise and energy, right? Correlative evidence is highly prized in medical science, right? So examples going back to the beginning, like smoking, weight gain, usually what we call a dose-response relationship. We also talk about correlations in public policy discussions, like gun availability and gun deaths, and then screen time and depression. And also there have been a number of studies recently coming out about the use or association between social media usage and depression. So they are correlated, there's a positive correlation between the amount of time we spend on social media and our propensity for depression. Does that mean that if you go on social media, you will be depressed? No, but we are discovering that the two are highly correlated, that the more time we spend on screens and the more time we spend on social media, there is an association between that and depression. So it doesn't mean that you will necessarily, but of course, we can plausibly claim, given the evidence, that there's a relationship between the two. So here's an example for the public policy discussion about guns and gun deaths. So somebody, again, we don't need to get into the gun control debate here, but this is the kind of causal arguments that people would be discussing, right? So this is from a study from over 10 years ago now, so it's already getting rather dated, but it was a pretty exhaustive study. Long story short, the authors make an argument that if you look at the states with the lowest legislative scores, meaning they have looser gun regulations, they have higher mortality rates per 100,000. Okay, so if you look, for example, at places like Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, places like that, they have relatively weak legislative scores, meaning they're more permissive, but they have higher gun death rates per 100,000. Now, are there outliers? Absolutely. So if you look at places like Pennsylvania is a good example. Where's another one? Michigan. They have stricter gun laws, but they still have more deaths than average than some other states. So of course there are outliers, but the authors are going to point to the fact that on the whole, we notice a trend that the stricter the gun laws are, the fewer deaths there are. Now, of course, people debate that, right? That's what the gun control debate is, certainly a sensitive one in the US, but this is the kind of stuff that people talk about with associations and correlations. Here's the major study from a few years ago about the correlation between depressive symptoms and screen activities. So the authors point to this correlation, right? Screen activities, as they rise, depressive symptoms have a higher Z-score. So reporting versus non-screen activities, right? Things that don't require a screen. So we would say those are correlated. But as everybody often points out, correlation does not always mean a causal relationship is present. Correlations could just be a coincidence. That's why we often hear correlation is not causation, but there is an association. So a silly example, an increase in home PC sales is technically correlated with a rise in the incidence of AIDS in Africa, but we don't think that there's any causal relationship between the rise of home PC sales and AIDS, right? Those don't seem to have any relationship, even though if we were to graph them over time, it would look like one causes the other when one doesn't cause the other, right? Many correlations may be explained in multiple ways, right? Sometimes correlations can be coincidental. Correlation does not necessarily imply causation. As we just mentioned, this is fallacious reasoning. So an example of that would be the universe is expanding, the price of textbooks is increasing, therefore the universe's expansion causes the price of textbooks to increase. Not good reasoning, right? Secondly, even if there is a connection, correlation by itself does not establish the direction of the connection. So it's possible, for example, that calmer people tend to be drawn to meditation rather than becoming calmer because they meditate, which is an interesting study that has been done. Third, some other cause may underlie and explain both of the correlates. So this is an interesting one. There's a lot of data that shows that students who sit near the front of the classroom perform better, but it could also be the case that some students' commitment to making the most of their schooling leads both to them sitting in the front and to better grades because they were already the kind of student that wanted better grades, right? So in that case, that cause explains both of the correlates. And then for a lot of cases, complex and multiple causes may be at work. So I think violence on TV could be both a reflection of society and also worsening violence, be both a cause and a reflection of certain forms of violence, but right, it can be very complicated. You often hear people say things like video games cause more violence, screen time, right? All these various things, but there might be multiple factors at play, right? Some things can be very complicated. So we don't want to oversimplify complex issues like violence in society or crime. Sometimes there are more complex causes at play. All right, a couple other things to keep in mind. A lot of times people misidentify relevant factors, right? You might say, instead of the wine causing the illness back at Elmo's bar, you could say, oh, well, maybe the waiter slipped something into our drink, which obviously you don't want to happen, but people will often misattribute who's responsible, right, without actually doing further investigation. So we want to be careful about that, given that we're aiming to be critical thinkers. Humans are also bad at handling multiple factors, right? So that's one of the things that Mill's methods are supposed to showcase, that we're trying to zero in on the relevant cause, but humans are really bad at juggling multiple different factors at the same time. We're also very easily misled by coincidences. People love to, right, talk about how something is fate or it was in the cards or, right, I'm just lucky. But coincidences have to happen, but people aren't very good at chalking it up to coincidence, but instead causing being the part of some underlying cause that maybe isn't there. Sometimes we get the order mixed up as well for causation, and specifically confusing cause and effect. So for misidentifying relevant factors, your ability to identify relevant factors depends mostly on your background knowledge, what you know about the kinds of conditions that could produce the occurrences in which you're interested, so that can help. And a lack of background knowledge might lead you to dismiss or ignore relevant factors or to assume that irrelevant factors must play a role. Confusing cause and effect, as I just mentioned. Sometimes we suspect that there is a causal relationship between two factors, but we may not know what causes what. So here's a good example with caffeine. So you could swap out coffee with energy drinks, for example, because I know those are a big deal. Does your coffee drinking cause you to feel stressed out, or do your feelings of being stressed out cause you to drink coffee? Because we know that caffeine is a stimulant, and sometimes when people have too much caffeine, they get stressed out, right? It leads to them being stressed out. But maybe when you get stressed out, you drink an energy drink, right? So one could be causing the other, and then vice versa, right? So we have to be careful about parsing those things out. And again, coincidences. People are especially prone to saying something like, it just can't be a coincidence, thinking because they misjudge the probabilities involved. So I think a good rule of thumb is in the book. Let's not assume that a causal connection exists unless we have good reasons or evidence for doing so. So yeah, there's a really good example in the book about coincidences and laws of probability, and they use an example of the lottery, of someone winning the lottery twice, which statistically we would expect to happen. We should expect at some point somebody to win the lottery twice, and that's exactly what happened to this woman in, I think it's New Jersey in the US. She won the lottery twice. And of course, everybody said, that's impossible, you must have cheated. But if you look at the probabilities, we expect somebody to win the lottery twice, given how long lotteries have been in place, right? So given the ordinary laws of statistics, incredible coincidences are common and even must occur. Any event, even one that seems shockingly improbable, is actually very probable over the long haul. Given enough opportunities to occur, an unlikely event is virtually certain to happen to someone at some point, right? So yes, are they incredibly lucky? Sure, but did they cheat just because something happened to them that seems really improbable? No. So this leads to a famous fallacy, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which humans are very, very prone to use. This is the fallacy of reasoning that just because B follows A, that A must have caused B. So here's a simple example. I brought candy for my class, let's say for all of you. Then the next day, they get an above average score on the exam. And then I attribute the good scores to candy, right? That may not be good reasoning, because maybe I have a group of students who really studied hard, or I had a lot of students come to my office hour, or they all took the practice test, something like that. So I would want to be careful about attributing that cause to the candy. Actually, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy was mentioned in, they misspelled it here, by the way. So in the meme, but it was used in the show Big Bang Theory. Sheldon's mother thinks that the reason that he showed up safely home was because she prayed for him. But Sheldon pointed out that, that could just be an instance of this fallacy, the post hoc fallacy. So there are lots of examples. I mean, we do this with remedies, right? So let's say I'm feeling really bad, and then, I have, I have some wine, and I have a headache, and then I say, oh, well, the wine cured my headache. Well, maybe it wasn't the wine, right? Maybe it was something else. So we have a tendency to use this fallacy all the time. We also use it with sports teams, right? I mean, I think that's a really good example. My team won because I wore my team's jersey, right? That's a post hoc fallacy, but an understandable one. People like to use it, but it's certainly fallacious reasoning. So I would encourage you to maybe try a few of these. I have two from the chapter. So this is, if you do have the book, which you should, this is chapter 9 in the second edition. If we look at exercise 9.1, number 2, I would encourage you to try to do this on your own. So we're asked to identify the conclusion and whether the argument appeals to the method of agreement, the method of difference, the joint method, or correlation. So if we look at number 2, it's a good example of something doctors tell us, right? That we need to eat lots of fruits and vegetables to protect against several types of cancer. So if we were to do it on number 2, our answer would look like, research suggests that eating lots of fruits and veggies may provide some protection against several types of cancer. That's the conclusion. This is correlation, right? As you eat more fruits and vegetables, the propensity or likelihood of developing certain kinds of cancer decreases. So that would be what we would call an inverse correlation. This seems like a strong argument. So that's how we would use Mill's methods to evaluate that. If we look at number 7, this one says, educators have frequently noted the connection between education level and salary, which is a good example. The higher a person's education level is, the higher his or her annual salary is likely to be. education increases people's earning power. So we have good statistics that back that up. Though I always joke with students by telling them that I'm the only one of my brothers to have graduated college, and none of them went to college, and they all make more money than me. So I always think that that's funny. But on the whole, if you look at enough data, there is a correlation between education levels and earning potential. So even though Anthony is a counterexample, right, I'm not a teacher to make a lot of money, we do know that there's a correlation between education level and earnings. So this would be another example of correlation. The conclusion is education increases people's earning power. Also seems like a strong argument, even though it's not always cogent. Here's another, just a couple simple examples going back to the Mill's methods. If we said Anthony's family went out to dinner last night, then after everyone went home, we all started to feel sick. The only thing that all of us ate were the breadsticks. Thus, the breadsticks caused our illness. Well, what's that? That's the method of agreement, right? What do we all have in common? So that's the method, the conclusion, the breadsticks caused our illness. Anthony's family went out to dinner last night. Then after everyone went home, we all started to feel sick, except for Anthony. The only thing that Anthony didn't get, but his family did, was the salad. Thus, the salad caused Anthony's family's illness. That would be the method of difference, right? Okay. Anthony's family went out to dinner last night. Then after everyone went home, half of us started to feel sick. All of us ate the salad, but half of us ate the pasta. But not everyone who ate the pasta got ill. Thus, the salad caused our illness. So what kind of reasoning is going on here? Well, this is the joint method, right? We're trying to figure out what they all have in common and what's different, and then we isolate what that is, right? So because not everyone who ate the pasta got ill, right? So we figure out what they all have in common and then isolate the differences, which is what clinical trials do. So we would be using the joint method here, okay? And if you want to look at 9.3, where it asks us to figure out what kind of cause it is, you could check yourself here. So number 1, Sylvia's being exposed to the influenza virus caused her to get the flu. Would that be a necessary or a sufficient condition, or both, or neither? Well, that's a necessary condition because you have to be exposed to the flu to get it, right? So being exposed to the flu is a necessary condition for getting the flu. Number 4, chopping off the head of the king put an end to him. Is that a necessary, sufficient, or both, or neither? Well, that's a sufficient condition. Why? Well, you can put an end to the king other than beheading them, right? So that's one way to do it. So that would be a sufficient condition, but there are certainly other ways. How about number 9, I think? A single spark started the internal combustion engine. I think it got misnumbered. Oops, sorry. Well, that's the wrong one. 5, 6, 9. Okay, 9 is a necessary. The one I just read is a necessary condition. Why? Because you need the spark in order to start the engine, right? Number 5 is, sorry, I didn't know I had these ones on here. The mighty Casey hit the ball out of the park, winning the game by 1 run. Well, that's a sufficient condition, right? Because you can win the game in other ways. And then how about 6? The straw broke the camel's back. That's also a sufficient condition, okay? So anyway, let me leave it there. Hopefully this makes sense. If you have any questions about causal reasoning in general, please be sure to let me know. And thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.